It was an ordinary day, until the phone rang and she learned she was no longer welcome in her own family. But the story didn't end there, and what followed took everyone by surprise. Margaret Taylor's day began, as most did, with sunlight streaming through her lace curtains and the smell of strong coffee filling her small kitchen. She had just sat down with her mug, her morning crossword, and the gentle hum of the radio when the phone rang, her son's number appearing on the screen. Margaret's heart did a small leap. Lately, calls from Daniel were rare. Since his marriage to Erin nearly 3 years ago, life had become busier, conversations shorter. Margaret cherished every chance to hear his voice. She pressed answer and greeted him, warmth bubbling up. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said, sounding tired. In the background, Margaret heard the faint clatter of dishes, the buzz of television. She pictured her son in the kitchen of his tidy suburban house, just across town but lately feeling an ocean away. They talked for a few minutes about the weather, Daniel's long hours at work, his upcoming vacation plans. Margaret asked about her grandsons, Ethan's soccer games, little Will's new school. Daniel's answers were polite but brief, his tone hurried. Then, a pause. "Listen, Mom," Daniel began, voice tightening. "There's something I have to talk to you about." Margaret's chest tightened. "Erin and I, well, Erin feels it might be better if we have some space for a while. She's asked that you not come by the house right now." The words landed with a dull thud. Margaret's grip tightened on her coffee mug. "Not come by." "Daniel, I don't understand. Did something happen?" Her mind raced. Had she offended Erin at the last birthday party? Was it the cookies she'd brought, the way she'd scolded Ethan for jumping on the sofa? She tried to keep her voice steady, but the old ache of being left out pressed against her ribs. Daniel hesitated, fumbling for words. "Erin just needs things to be a bit quieter. She's been overwhelmed, and she thinks it would be best for now." Margaret listened, the room suddenly colder. She pressed for more, but Daniel's responses grew vaguer. "It's not just you, Mom. Erin's trying to set boundaries. She needs her own space, her own routine with the boys. She's really stressed lately." Margaret bit back tears, keeping her voice as even as she could. "And you agree with her?" Daniel paused. "I just want everyone to get along. I think it's best if we give it a little time. I'll call you soon, okay?" He hung up before she could protest further. Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen, heart thudding, phone still in hand. She stared at the calendar on the fridge, at the dates she'd circled, Ethan's birthday, Will's class play, Sunday dinners she'd promised to bring her famous roast. All of it now felt distant, unreachable. She replayed the conversation again and again. What had she done wrong? Should she have called less, visited less, brought fewer gifts for the boys? The silence of the house was oppressive. She made another pot of coffee but barely touched it. Later that morning, Margaret tried calling Daniel again, hoping for more explanation, but her call went to voicemail. She left a message, gentle, apologetic, full of love and confusion. She tried Erin's number too, but the call rang unanswered. Unable to sit still, Margaret wandered her house, tidying rooms that didn't need it, watering plants that were already damp. She dusted the boys' framed pictures on the mantel, Ethan's gap-toothed grin, Will in his Halloween costume, and wondered when she'd see them next. She baked a batch of shortbread, hoping the ritual might soothe her nerves, but the kitchen only smelled like loss. Afternoon brought more silence. Margaret considered reaching out to her sister or a friend but hesitated, embarrassed to admit she'd been shut out. Instead, she wrote a letter to Daniel, careful, heartfelt, asking what she could do differently, telling him how much she loved them all. She placed it on the hall table, unsure if she'd ever send it. The hours crawled by. Margaret busied herself with laundry, reading, watching old movies with the volume low. She jumped each time her phone buzzed, hoping for a message that didn't come. As dusk fell, she set the dinner table for one, appetite gone. That night, Margaret lay in bed, sleep elusive. She replayed every visit, every conversation with Erin, searching for the moment things had gone wrong. The ache of exclusion was sharp, but even sharper was the knowledge that her own son, her Daniel, had let this happen. She watched the moonlight trace patterns on her ceiling and wondered what the morning would bring. Morning brought little relief. Margaret drifted through her usual routines, everything tinged with unease. She watered the garden, swept the front porch, and checked her phone obsessively for messages that never arrived. The sun climbed higher, brightening the empty street, but the heaviness in Margaret's chest didn't lift. At noon, she drove to the grocery store, hoping the bustle might distract her. Instead, every aisle reminded her of the boys: Will's favorite cereal, Ethan's beloved juice boxes, the treat she always bought for family dinners. She stood staring at the bakery counter, remembering how Ethan used to beg for the sprinkle cookies. Margaret blinked back tears, abandoning her cart halfway through and hurrying home empty-handed. Her phone buzzed with a message: her friend Alice, checking in, lunch this week. Margaret hesitated, then typed back, maybe another time. She couldn't imagine explaining the hurt, the humiliation. She settled for tea at her kitchen table, the house so quiet she could hear the tick of every clock. Later, she tidied the guest room where the boys used to nap, stacking their forgotten toys into neat piles. She called her sister and, for the first time, confessed what had happened. "She just banned you," her sister exclaimed, disbelief turning to anger. "And Daniel, he just let it happen." Margaret nodded, tears rising. "He says Erin's overwhelmed. I guess I just make things harder." Her sister tried to comfort her, promising to visit soon, but Margaret felt hollow when she hung up. She looked at the letter to Daniel, still unsent, and wondered if she'd ever have the courage to mail it. That afternoon, she walked to the park, letting the wind tangle her hair. She passed mothers chasing toddlers, grandparents pushing strollers, fathers tossing balls to their children. Every laugh, every shout was a fresh ache. She sat on a bench, watching a little girl feed ducks with her grandmother, and felt the loss settle deeper. On her way home, Margaret stopped at the mailbox but couldn't bring herself to send the letter. Instead, she thumbed through old photos: Daniel as a child, all scraped knees and wild grins, their first holidays with Erin, the birth of each grandson. She remembered the day Daniel had called to say, "You're going to be a grandma." How her heart had soared with joy and hope. By evening, Margaret's loneliness grew sharper. She ate a quiet dinner, washed the dishes, and tried to read but found herself distracted, the words blurring together. She checked her phone once more before bed. Still nothing from Daniel. That night, rain tapped at the windows as Margaret sat in her favorite chair, clutching a faded blanket. She told herself she would give them space, just as they'd asked. But as the hours crept by, she wondered if her family would ever feel like hers again. A restless week dragged by. Margaret moved through her days, the routines feeling both comforting and empty. She dusted the living room, folded laundry, and lingered at the kitchen window, watching cars pass on the street, hoping each one might bring Daniel or the boys. Her friend Alice called again, gently persistent. "Margaret, you've missed bridge club twice now. Are you all right?" Margaret forced cheer into her voice, telling Alice she was just tired, that she'd join them next week. Alice offered to bring lunch, but Margaret declined, embarrassed by how small her world had become. The ache of separation grew sharper each time she passed the hall table, the letter to Daniel still sitting unsent. Every day, she picked it up, reread the words, sometimes adding a line or two, always ending with, "Love, Mom." But she never sealed the envelope. On Friday, Margaret tried baking with a neighbor's granddaughter, 8-year-old Hannah. The girls' laughter echoed in the kitchen as they decorated cupcakes with blue frosting and sprinkles. For a fleeting hour, Margaret felt some of her old lightness return. When Hannah's mother arrived, she thanked Margaret, saying, "She loves coming here. It's so nice, having someone patient and kind." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling and breaking all at once. Later, Margaret called Daniel's house, letting it ring until voicemail picked up. She left a gentle message, asking after the boys, telling him she missed him and that she'd love to help if Erin needed a break. Hours passed with no reply. That evening, Margaret walked past Daniel Street on her way home from the pharmacy. She saw the house, warm lights glowing in the windows, a car in the driveway, Ethan's bike leaning against the porch rail. She slowed, remembering the dozens of times she'd brought over dinner, babysat, or sat on that very porch sipping tea with her grandson snuggled on her lap. Temptation tugged at her, but she kept walking, afraid of making things worse. She returned home to the cold quiet, a cup of chamomile tea, and an aching uncertainty about where she belonged. On Saturday, her sister arrived for lunch, bringing fresh bread and sunflowers. Over soup, Margaret finally poured out the whole story, her confusion, her fear that she'd lost her son for good. Her sister listened, offering hugs and outrage in equal measure. "You've always been there for them. If Daniel can't see that, it's his loss, not yours." Margaret tried to believe it. She tidied the kitchen, walked her sister to the door, and thanked her for the company. Alone again, she stared at her calendar, realizing that Sunday dinner would pass without a call, a visit, or the sound of little voices at her table. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret wrote in her journal, memories of Daniel as a little boy, the silly stories he used to tell, the promise she'd made to herself to never let him feel alone. She wondered if he'd forgotten that promise, or if life had just grown too loud for him to remember. As dawn crept across the ceiling, Margaret resolved to keep loving, even at a distance. She would wait, she told herself, for a crack in the wall, for her son's voice, for a sign that her family hadn't vanished for good. Margaret tried to keep herself busy as another week slipped by. She gardened in the crisp morning air, cutting back rose bushes and pulling weeds, her gloves damp with earth. The quiet felt different now, heavy rather than peaceful, every birdsong a reminder of what was missing. She joined Alice and the others for bridge club, letting herself be swept up in the small dramas of bidding and strategy. Conversation buzzed around her, talk of grandchildren's recitals, photos passed from hand to hand. Margaret smiled and nodded, but her laughter sounded thin even to her own ears. Alice caught her during a break. "You don't seem yourself, Margaret. I know something's wrong. Please talk to me." For a moment, Margaret wanted to share it all, the pain of being shut out, the confusion, the longing for her son and the boys. Instead, she shook her head, thanking Alice for her concern. "Just tired, that's all." One afternoon, she received a group text from Erin, photos from Will's school play. Will in a homemade dinosaur hat, Ethan grinning in the background. Margaret's heart ached at seeing them only through a screen. She typed a quick reply, "Looks wonderful. Give them hugs from Grandma," but no response came. Days bled together. She cooked small meals, walked in the park, sometimes sharing a bench with other grandparents. She overheard stories about family visits, birthday parties, the chaos and joy of being surrounded by loved ones. Margaret listened, feeling both envy and a strange, distant hope. She finally mailed the letter to Daniel. After days of indecision, she sealed the envelope and placed it gently in the box, her hands trembling. That evening, she felt a flicker of relief. At least her love was on the record, her words reaching out across the growing gap. Sunday, usually her favorite day, was especially hard. She dressed in her best sweater and set the table for one, the house silent except for the clink of her fork against her plate. She imagined the boys' laughter, Daniel carving roast, Erin lighting candles in the kitchen. Margaret closed her eyes and let the memory play, wishing it could return. The next day brought a knock at her door, her neighbor, Mr. Taylor, asking for help with his garden tools. Margaret welcomed the distraction, chatting as she cleaned rust from the shears and shared stories about her own roses. For a few minutes, the ache receded, replaced by the comfort of ordinary friendship. Later, she called her sister, who reminded her, "You're still part of your family, no matter what anyone says. Just hold on, Meg. People come around, even when it takes longer than we'd like." That night, Margaret found herself at her bedroom window, watching the lights of Daniel's neighborhood in the distance. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, whispering good night to the grandson she missed, and hoping that somewhere in the quiet, Daniel was thinking of her too. Margaret woke to gray skies and the steady patter of rain against her windows. She made her coffee, spooned out jam onto toast, and sat alone at the table, the old ache in her chest sharper than usual. She checked her phone, no new messages, no missed calls. She scrolled through the photos from Erin's text again, wishing she could hear Will's laugh in person, see Ethan's proud smile up close. With the weather keeping her indoors, Margaret busied herself with chores. She sorted through boxes in the attic, uncovering old birthday cards from Daniel and the boys, yellow drawings, and school crafts with crooked hearts and the words, "Love you, Grandma." She arranged them on her desk, letting the memories warm her through the cold day. Around noon, her friend Alice stopped by with a loaf of fresh bread and a small bouquet of daisies. "I was in the neighborhood," Alice said, though Margaret suspected she'd come on purpose. They shared tea and a simple lunch, Alice gently steering the conversation to lighter topics. Books, the new bakery in town, plans for the library fundraiser. Margaret let herself be distracted, even laughing once or twice. Still, the ache lingered beneath the surface. After Alice left, Margaret drafted a text to Daniel. "Thinking of you. Hope you're all well. Miss you and the boys." But hesitated before sending it. She deleted the words and instead went for a walk when the rain eased. The air was brisk and smelled of wet earth. She passed families bundled in raincoats, children splashing in puddles, grandparents trailing behind. Each sight stung, but she forced herself to smile at the small joys unfolding around her. Back home, Margaret baked a batch of scones and set aside a few for Daniel's family, out of habit. She packed them in a tin and placed it by the door, knowing she wouldn't deliver them but unable to throw them away. She wondered if Erin would ever allow her to come by again, if Daniel missed her visits, if the boys asked for her. That evening, Margaret called her sister, grateful for the comfort of a familiar voice. They talked late into the night, sharing stories from childhood, laughing until Margaret felt lighter. Her sister promised, "This won't last forever, Meg. Love doesn't just disappear." After the call, Margaret sat in her favorite chair with a quilt pulled over her knees, the tin of scones on the table beside her. The silence in the house was thick but softer now, filled with memories, hopes, and the stubborn, enduring love that refused to fade. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret promised herself she would keep reaching out, keep hoping for the day the silence would finally break. Another week slipped past, each day both heavy and hopeful. Margaret woke each morning, checked her phone, and tried not to let disappointment settle too deep when there was nothing from Daniel. Still, she kept up small routines, feeding the birds, volunteering at the library, smiling at neighbors in the market. On Tuesday, a surprise came. The doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find Ethan and Will on her porch, bundled in jackets, Erin standing behind them, tense but polite. "We're on our way to the dentist," Erin explained. "The boys wanted to drop off a card." Ethan thrust a crumpled envelope into Margaret's hands, cheeks flushed with excitement. "We made it for you at school." Will chimed in, "It's got stickers." Margaret knelt, hugging them both quickly, heart pounding with joy and anxiety. Erin stood at a distance, arms folded, not meeting Margaret's gaze. "Thank you for the card, darlings," Margaret said softly. "I miss you so much." Ethan squeezed her hand. Will asked, "Can we come for cookies soon?" Erin's eyes flickered and she said, "We'll see. Say goodbye, boys." They hugged Margaret again, quick, tight, the smell of their shampoo lingering as they ran back to the car. Margaret waved until they disappeared. Back inside, she opened the card. It was covered in marker hearts and crooked letters. "We love you, Grandma." From Ethan and Will. Tears fell, but for the first time in weeks, they were mixed with hope. That evening, Margaret baked a fresh batch of scones, just in case. She drafted another note to Daniel, careful and kind, thanking him for the card, asking if the boys might visit for tea next week. She placed it in the mailbox, hands trembling. The next few days brought no reply, but the memory of the boys' quick hugs buoyed her. She went to bridge club, laughing more easily, letting Alice in on a bit of her sadness and relief. Alice squeezed her hand. "Kids come around, Meg. Just keep being you." Saturday morning, Margaret received a brief text from Daniel. "Thanks for the note, Mom. Things are hectic, but the boys liked seeing you. We'll let you know about next week." She read the message over and over, holding on to it as a sign the wall might be thinning, just a little. Sunday was quiet, but lighter. Margaret made tea and set 2 extra places at the table, letting herself hope. She tended the roses, cleaned the spare room, and smiled at the card on her fridge, sticky, lopsided, and overflowing with love. As evening settled, she stood by the window, watching the sunset, breathing deeply, and promising herself she'd stay patient, ready to open her door the moment her family needed her again. Margaret woke early, nerves buzzing. She spent the morning dusting, tidying the living room, and preparing a fresh batch of scones. She arranged the kitchen table with her best plates, poured juice, and set out the boys' favorite strawberry jam, just in case. Every creak of the house made her heart race, half hope, half dread. By late morning, her phone rang. It was Daniel. "Hey, Mom," he said, voice careful but softer than before. "If you're free, I thought I'd bring the boys by for a visit. Erin's got errands to run." Margaret almost dropped the phone in relief. "Of course, Daniel. I'd love that." 30 minutes later, she opened her door to Ethan and Will, bundled in bright coats, faces bright with excitement. Daniel followed, looking tired but grateful. The boys tumbled inside, talking at once, demanding hugs, asking about the scones they'd smelled baking. Margaret knelt to meet them, laughter rising in her chest for the first time in weeks. They spent the afternoon playing board games, building a castle from sofa cushions, and sharing stories. Daniel scrolled through photos on his phone, showing Margaret the boys' artwork and videos from school. For a moment, the awkwardness faded, replaced by the familiar warmth of family. Ethan whispered, "We missed you, Grandma. Mom says we can't come a lot, but maybe sometimes." Margaret hugged him tightly, tears stinging her eyes. Will drew a picture at the kitchen table, 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled Grandma plus us. When Daniel took a call in the backyard, Margaret sat with the boys, answering their questions and helping with a puzzle. She cherished the ordinariness of it, sticky hands, spilled juice, the echo of laughter in her kitchen. Later, Daniel lingered by the door as the boys put on their shoes. "Thanks for today, Mom," he said quietly. "Things with Aaron are complicated, but I want the boys to know you're here." Margaret nodded, careful not to press. "I'm always here, Daniel. No matter what." He hugged her quickly, the way he had as a boy, and shepherded Ethan and Will out to the car. Margaret waved until they disappeared around the corner, heart soaring and aching all at once. She spent the evening putting away toys, wiping down the table, and rereading the boys' new drawings. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt gentler, filled with hope instead of loss. As she prepared for bed, Margaret left her porch light on, just in case another visit came sooner than she dared to dream. The next morning, Margaret woke to sunlight and the echo of children's laughter still ringing in her memory. She brewed coffee, set a place at the table for herself, and smiled at the newest drawing stuck to the fridge, 3 smiling figures with yellow hair, hands joined, beneath a crooked sun. She called her sister, describing every moment of the boys' visit, Ethan's wild stories, Will's sticky fingers, Daniel's quiet gratitude. Her sister laughed and listened, reminding her, "Love always finds a way back in, Meg, even when it takes its time." Margaret went about her day with a new energy. She delivered scones to Alice, who insisted she stay for tea and pressed her for details about the visit. Margaret told her everything, from Ethan's board game victory dance to Daniel's tired smile at the door. "You see," Alice said softly, "sometimes it just takes patience. You belong with them." Throughout the week, Margaret kept her phone close. She texted Daniel simple messages, "No pressure, just warmth, hope the boys are well, let me know if you need anything." Sometimes, he replied. Sometimes, he didn't. But the ache had softened. She had her memories, her hopes, and her stubborn, steady love. Sunday came. Margaret dressed in her favorite sweater, prepared a small roast, and set out the best dishes. The house was still quiet, but the table felt less lonely. She played the radio, humming along as she chopped vegetables, and paused now and then to look at the boys' art, letting the small joys anchor her heart. In the evening, as dusk settled and lamps glowed in the windows of Daniel's neighborhood, Margaret stood at her door and looked up at the first stars. She whispered a simple wish, for more laughter, for forgiveness, for the slow rebuilding of trust. Before bed, she wrote in her journal, about the heartbreak and the healing, about how love endures, quietly and fiercely, even when it must wait. She promised herself to keep her heart open, to keep her porch light on, always. That night, Margaret slipped beneath her quilt and drifted to sleep, her dreams full of children's voices, warm kitchens, and the unbreakable bond that only family can forge.